My Lord Provost, Miss Jean Maxwell Scott, Your Grace, my Lords, ladies and gentlemen, your Chairman, the Right Honourable Lord Tweedsmuir, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, holder of the Canadian Forces Decoration, Doctor of Laws, will propose the toast of the evening, the memory of Sir Walter Scott.
My Lord Provost, Miss Maxwell Scott, Your Grace, my Lords, ladies and gentlemen, tonight we meet to honour the memory of Sir Walter Scott. I'm very deeply grateful to you for inviting me to occupy this chair, which my wife and my father have preceded me. Once a year we meet at this time to remember this man whose impact on European literature and the world itself was without equal. This was the man of whom George Trevelyan, who was probably our greatest historian, wrote, "First taught the English to admire Scotland and reconciled the two nations to a joyful pride in their partnership." Now this club has met for a good many years now, since 1894. In that time, Scott has been judged by Victorian values, Edwardian values, the values of that strange traumatic period between the two wars, and the strange jeering, jostling age that succeeded the last war. But Walter Scott remains, because he's a being who is beyond the age or generation. He's timeless and changeless as the figure of the shepherd and his dog and his flock of sheep upon our own border hills. It's far beyond me to produce an analysis that is original of Walter Scott and what he did. I'm merely as an ordinary Scotsman seeking to understand him. I grew up in the household of a romantic Scottish writer. As a very small boy, I just remember the visits of my great-great-uncle John Henderson to our house in London. His old nurse had been frightened as a small child by Prince Charlie's Highlanders entering Derby. Now we children longed from our very earliest years for the summer to come round for our return to Tweedside. And on the Sabbath in Peeblesshire, we occasionally exchanged the kirk at Broughton for the tiny kirk at Tweedsmuir, to which the shepherds came and brought their collie dogs, and the dogs sat at their feet throughout the sermon. And the Tweed tumbles there below the old stone bridge, at the foot of the mound on which stands that tiny kirk, which was written around the graves of the martyrs, the warps are crying. There's many a Covenanter buried there, as well as those names inscribed on those great tall tombstones of shepherds who lost their lives and perished in great snowstorms. In Scotland, our history is always in very easy reach. Now the name of that little clachan has been transplanted by one of its sons to christen a sheep station in Queensland. And after my father, it's a provincial park in British Columbia, about the size of Wales, a glacier in the Yukon, a town in Saskatchewan, a school in New Zealand, and for my father and myself a group of Arctic islands, and appropriately for my own self a tiny Arctic rock plant. Each year we meet here in this club to remember Walter Scott and evaluate his achievements against a changing background of our present-day life. Unlike so many men of letters, he never lost sight of, never been lost sight of, and had to be self-consciously revived. He's always been there. I shall do my best to try to understand him, and I do not believe that I can probably interpret him. We've all read him. I shall not quote him. If I started quoting him, we should be here all night. But I shall merely try to put my own, but rather feeble, understanding of him. I'd like to say that at the start, it's a very civilized and sensible custom in this club to have the toast to the armed forces and to the city of Edinburgh, his city. Scott had been destined to be a soldier. It was only because that he had that fever which gave him his lameness that he couldn't become one. As far as he could envy anyone, he envied those who followed the calling of arms. To him, the humblest porter of a musket was a better man than himself. The fever that left him lame as a child ordained that his adventures had to be confined to those of the mind. It was that set him so furiously to reading. Said of him that he was so well read in so many histories of so many countries that he could speak of things that happened centuries ago as if he were a contemporary. Curiously, other Scottish men of letters were fascinated by the career of arms. On Burns's coffin was put his militia cap, for which he had not paid. Stevenson, on his sickbed, would conjure up visions of leading a great force of irregular cavalry, of turning in his saddle to watch them thundering behind him as they reached the high ground in the moonlight, leaving the burning valley behind and below. Scott could not join an infantry unit owing to his lameness. But when they formed the Royal Edinburgh Volunteer Light Dragoons, he joined with gusto, became their quartermaster. He was wearing their uniform when he was presented the Tsar of Russia while on a visit to Paris. The Tsar naturally assumed that he'd served in Wellington's army and courteously asked him in what battles he'd taken part. Sir Walter replied, in some slight action, such as the Battle of the Cross Causeway and the affair of Morden Mill. We now take the language that we speak for granted. One of Britain's most remarkable achievements was that at the Norman Conquest we taught our conquerors our own tongue. Chaucer pulled it together into a language. Our Scottish valiant might well have swept the world had it not been for the Reformation, which brought our literature to a grinding halt. The Scots tongue was left to politics, theology, some law, little history. It's powerfully expressive. Compare the robustness of a pursuer and a defender with those two bloodless phantoms, a plaintiff and a defendant. And again, the intimation from the pulpit that there is a purpose of marriage, compared with we may mention the names of the two couple. Now, in the 18th century, Burns produced an exotic poetic tongue, which wasn't the language of his day or of anybody else's day. He created poetic Scots, which interpreted Scotsmen to each other. He was the weaver of a poetic tradition, together the different strains in our history. As a poet, he had to create his own poetic language, where none existed before. The Scottish border in the 18th century separated two peoples, each suspicious of and bitterly hostile to the other, with marked differences in language. The benefits of the Union of 1707 were very slow in coming. After the Porteous riots in 1736, 3 Scottish lords of the justiciary, the Lords Down, Royston and Kames, were summoned to the bar of the House of Lords. Lord Down gave his 2 fellow lords a highly patronizing disquisition on how well he was versed in the English language, adding that he didn't expect the other lords to be able to understand his better than himself. When they appeared, all 3 were completely unintelligible to the assembled peers. But Scottish authors by that time knew well they had to write for an English public. For even by the end of that century, there were only some 400,000 literate Scots. In 1761, about 300 citizens, my Lord Provost of our great city, attended a course of 12 lectures from Thomas Sheridan, the dramatist. He undertook to teach them absolutely correct English pronunciation in a very strong Irish brogue. 12 years later, Dr. Johnson, on a visit to Edinburgh, gave a fillip to the teaching of English. His dictionary, published 8 years before, for the first time laid down a correct spelling. It's very interesting that very few of the great passages of Burns and none of the great passages of Scott are in strong Scottish dialect. It's not an easy vehicle for the written word. My father wrote a novel called Witchwood about witchcraft in 17th century Scotland. Much of it was in idiomatic border dialect. A book by an established novelist sells not entirely on its own merits, if at all, but to a great extent on the popularity of his previous book. For that reason, Witchwood sold well, because its predecessor had a wide popular appeal. Witchwood's successor, which should have had at least as much appeal, sold hardly at all. The Scottish dialect, it doesn't read awfully well to the ordinary reader. Now, up to the time that Dr. Johnson's dictionary was published, there was no such thing as correct spelling. You could say to somebody, I like your spelling, or I don't like your spelling. What you couldn't say is that you spelled something wrong, because there was no right or wrong in the thing at all. Yeah. In mid-18th century, nothing could have been worse than the relation between English and the Scots. English had a rarely bad scare when Prince Charles's army reached as far as Derby, which called them hurriedly to call a couple of armies of the continent to meet the threat. And then when all that was over, those Englishmen who went to Scotland went mostly on purposes of pressing business. On return, they spoke of a bare treeless country, a ragged populace, almost unintelligible in speech. They spoke of spending nights in filthy inns compared so unfavourably with the snug hostelries south of the border. Oliver Goldsmith, who after all was not blind to aesthetic considerations, in 1753, in his tour of Great Britain, described Drumlanrig as being like a fine picture in a dirty grotto. It's environed with mountains which have the wildest, most hideous aspect of any and all the south part of Scotland. To the English, Scotland was hideous because it was hateful. To the few Scots who came south and made a name for themselves, did not add too much to our popularity. In 1763, Lord Bute became our most unpopular Prime Minister, largely because he was a Scot. 9 years later, the crash of Alexander Fordyce, who came from my own parish in Aberdeenshire, and the banking network with which he was associated, set off a chain reaction of disaster. Half of Ayrshire changed hands, it was said, as a result. The effect on an overstretched London capital market was absolutely calamitous. Horace Walpole, who seized his pen, as he very easily did, and wrote to a friend, as these fellows are Scotsmen, all the clamour against their country is revived. The English despise the Scots in return loathe the English. Into this Scotland, Walter Scott was born, and with him an absolutely new era. After the poverty of the 17th century, the tide of the second Scottish Renaissance began to run. Heavier became the pall of smoke over Glasgow. In the course of the century, the revenue was to rise 51 times. Land was drained and forests were planted. Considerations of beauty started to count more and more. The rose was valued as high as the cabbage. The finest era of Scots architecture dawned, and with the landscaping of grounds and the laying out of gardens. But it was a very limited literary world for a writer. 3/5 of the published word was printed sermons. Scott, as an invalid in his childhood, had been left a very great deal by himself. And his thoughts started to run from his earliest days to run out to romantic ends. From earliest youth he was a deep reader. It was inevitable this reservoir would fill and spill out in writing. He's often credited with having started the Gothic revival. That isn't true. It first showed in architecture, and Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill Gothic dwelling was built 20 years before he was born. But he broadened it and gave it enormous impetus, and was in full flood for many years after his death. My wife and I once lived in Braemar Castle, and my daughter sitting over there, as far as I've ever been able to make out, is the only child who was ever born there. It is the scene of the stag hunt in Waverley. Now, I've seen a painting of it by Gustave Doré in the 1860s. Near the castle shown in a swirl of black and angry cloud. If they're not actually vampire bats shown there, they're heavily suggested. And the architecture in its various variants is symbolized forever to us in Abbotsford and Balmoral, and Lancia was its artist. Anybody who's come here tonight from a home or a hostel which embodies the suggestion of a castle turret or an arrow slit in a Victorian or more recent building well knows that same tradition. Scott's father was a man of law, and Scott was called to the bar in 1792. He was 21. 7 years later, he was appointed sheriff deputy in Selkirkshire. That meant residing for 4 months of the year in the sheriffdom and moving from Lass Wade, which has been mentioned earlier tonight, where he and his young life were living in Ashes Hill. Their first child, a boy, had died. Now they had a daughter. 3 years later, he produced his first edition of Border Ballads, his first great ballad, The Lady of the Lake, in 1805. The year before, he'd been appointed Clerk of Session, a post that kept him busy for about 6 months every year. But he'd been an established critic on the Edinburgh Review before he turned to poetry, and had written the first 5 chapters of Waverley before he finished with the ballads and turned to the novels, which set the seal on his world fame. He seemed to be able to combine the sheriffdom and the clerkship with his writing, which he had felt conflicted with his work at the bar. He wrote a letter to Lady Louisa Stewart, who was one of his most candid and splendid critics, and said who would trust their cause to the author of The Lay of the Last Minstrel. He had no solemn mystique about lawyers or writers. Several of his villains were lawyers. He claimed no privileges for poets or authors. He sometimes showed an almost boyish irreverence for his craft. In January 1808, he wrote to Lady Louisa, "Marmion is at this moment gasping upon Flodden Field, and there I have been obliged to leave him for 3 days in the death pang. I hope I shall find time enough this morning to knock him on the head with 2 or 3 thumping stanzas." Scott imitated no one. He was become the friend of every great contemporary poet and resembled none of them. In calling such as commerce or the sciences, success goes to the originator or the adapter. The originators are remembered longer, that the adapters commonly die richer. Authors can more easily combine the two. A pen fitted very easily into Walter Scott's hands. As a very young man in need of money, he once copied out 120 folio pages with round about 10,000 words, without a break for food or rest. His temperament was right for it. When he became an established writer, he rose early, had 6 months' work behind him before the day was done. He gave up working at night when he found his health suffered from it. He was compulsive diarist, which we may be most profoundly grateful. Not only such splendid descriptions as his voyage round the Northern Lights in 1814, but the sharing with of his innermost thoughts. And I may say, in reference to what the Admiral said a little bit earlier, that Scott was absolutely no stranger to naval perils, because that particular ship he went round the Northern Lights with had to carry 6 cannon against privateers, and this ship, the Royal Navy, had to send a man of war in front of them to just see that there were no American privateers in the way. He first began to write seriously as a critic for the Edinburgh Review. At the same time, he was collecting and publishing his collections of border ballads, and saved so much of value from oblivion. There was no venom in his criticism, but he could make his disapproval crystal clear. A certain Colonel Thornton carried out what would now be called a safari, with rods, guns, hawks, and a mob of retainers, on foot and on horseback, throughout northern and western Scotland. He even retained a sloop as a base for supplies. Perhaps Sir Walter was rather nettled by the title of the Colonel's book, A Sporting Tour Through Northern Parts of England. The book was published in 1804, and Walter Scott reviewed it in the Edinburgh Review the year following. He wrote, "The performance is termed The Sporting Tour, a long, minute, and prolix account of every grouse or blackcock which had the honour to fall by the gun of our literary sportsman, of every pike which gorged his bait, of every bird which was pounced by his hawks, of every blunder which was made by his servants, and of every bottle which was drunk by himself and his friends. Now this we apprehend exceeds the license given to sportsmen. His essay on Lawrence Sterne and his works was included by Lord Birkenhead in his collection of the 100 Best English Essays. Sometimes his criticism was shorter and terser, believing that his friend the Ettrick shepherd was falling from a pedestrian vein. He said a vile sixpenny planet looked in at the window the night James Hogg was born. The literary criticism of the Edinburgh Review was far ahead of any other paper in the British Isles, and shows the prestige that Scotland by that time had won. As a writer, Scott was a phenomenon. He wrote at a most tremendous speed. He never polished a sentence because there was no time to do so. He, oddly enough, frequently used Elizabethan words which had dropped from the language of literature almost 100 years before. His output was absolutely miraculous. Trollope was one day to claim that he had written even more while having, like Scott, other pressing occupations. But this detracts nothing from the dimension of Scott's achievements. In the main, his greatest characters are cast in secondary roles. He had that sure technique that you see today in French drama of ensuring that even the most minor parts are faultlessly acted. He had an abiding interest in the human race in all its conditions. He gladly admitted the identity of those on whom he'd modelled his characters. It's interesting how broad a spread of agreement there is about his greatest characters. Just to take one of them, Jeannie Deans in Old Mortality. She was modelled on a certain Helen Walker who died in 1791 and is buried in the village of Arngray in Kirkcudbrightshire. Sir Walter paid for her headstone and wrote the epitaph, which begins, "This stone was erected by the author of Waverley." It was put up at a time when all the world knew who the author of Waverley really was. Perhaps it lifts a little bit of a curtain on it. People often ask, why did he write Waverley anonymously? Well, he rarely told us the answer. If the book was a failure, he didn't want the failure pointed at him. He was an established poet. He didn't want to detract from his reputation in that way. And he said himself in the introduction to Waverley, I can render little better reason for choosing to remain anonymous than by saying with Shylock that such was my humour. He also seems to have felt at one time that writing of novels didn't entirely accord with a legal practice and high legal office. It was curious, looking back now, to see for how many years only the most intimate friends of Scott knew who the author of Waverley really was. Scott's fortunes rose, remained high, and fell like the tides of the sea. He was stayed at the height of the tide for several years, ended in 1814, I think, but he stayed on the top. The rise ended in 1814, but he stayed on the top of that rise until everything went wrong in 1827. He maintained his incredible momentum of writing, broken in health but unbelievably gallant and everlastingly original. Other hands had to hold the pen now. Of his two scribes, he preferred John Ballantyne, who was more professional. Scott lay on the sofa. John sat opposite to him. He always had a dozen pens, cut and ready. Scotty records always finished the dictation of a sentence, although he could not resist a cry of pain, and the quill scratched steadily across the paper with the note of a corncrake. John's eyes twinkled at some of the text he had to copy. Walter Laidlaw, the other scribe, couldn't suppress the exclamation of surprise and delight. God help us all, the like of that, oh, sir. Much else beside that tended to dam the flow of literature. Scott dictated The Bride of Lammermoor from the depths of suffering so terrible that he did not recognize his own work afterwards, and with it the whole of the legend of Montrose and most of Ivanhoe. Scott never showed an understanding of his own people more clearly than in his phrase. Every Scottish man has a pedigree, and 'tis his natural prerogative, as in Eiland was his pride and his poverty. Most men of letters live only in their books. Scott came to be admired by many who never read a word of them. He was as splendid and arresting a character as any that he ever created. Had he maintained the secret of his authorship, as he did for many years of the Waverley novels, his books would never have been so famous. When he revealed the country to itself and to the world, he stood revealed himself. The men in his books became part and parcel of each other. What will always remain a mystery is how rapidly the fame of both spread. And that at a time when world communications were so erratic that we went to war with America in 1812, several weeks after all causes of war had been removed, and fighting continued for several months after the armistice had been signed. He stands forth as the quintessential Scotsman. In Elizabeth Bowen's words, there's something warm and commanding that seemed to mellow the air. His writing appealed at one and the same time to men as different as Lord Bowden, Goethe on the continent, Washington Irving in America, and the soldiers of the 58th Regiment in the line of Torres Vedras, who would lie down just clear of the bullets while their commanding officer, Sir Adam Ferguson, held them absorbed by reading The Lady of the Lake. Even more impressive was the great wave of sympathy, not only from all over Britain, they were a large part of Europe, when Scott fell into his financial troubles, the closing months of his life. Our Scottish muse is very different from her sisters. She has the salt of the pedestrian, varied with the highest flights of romance. Like gifted Gilfillan in Waverley, we can turn from contemplating the New Jerusalem of the saints to the price of beasts at Mauchline Fair. The most prosaic of Scottish homes is somewhere a casement that opens onto magic seas. Scott leaves very few of us untouched. His characters are so rare we've met most of them in our own lives. Those who would deny that Scott meant anything to them would probably talk at some time or another of nailing their colours to the mast, or the pine that blood is thicker than water, or enjoining someone to tell it to the Marines, without realizing that Scott coined every one of those phrases. As for Abbotsford, Scott's greatest supporters tend rather to hang their heads. To my mind, this is a totally understandable creation of a romantic and absolutely generous man. For a man so steeped in the past and so much in love with that countryside and its people. Carlyle could say scathingly that fast as the new gold came in from the Waverley novels, or even faster, it changed into many acres, into stone and hewn or planted wood. So be it. He had several years of happiness there. It helped sustain him in times of fearful tribulation. Now he died peacefully. Now, since the first meeting of this club, your chairman have sought to analyze Scott's writing. Clearly, it's not for me to try to follow too closely in their tracks. If I started to quote my favorite passages, we would be here all night. But all of us must be struck by that extraordinary smooth flow of Scott's genius, borne on a tide of emotion, varied every now and then by the most astonishing lapses when the emotion faltered. Perhaps the most terrible example of this is the word he puts into the mouth of that fascinating, beloved Di Vernon, of all people. She talks to Rashleigh Osbaldiston and says, "Dismiss from your company the false arch-image dissimulation, and it will better ensure our free access in our classical consultations." Well, I think that somebody always makes a mistake in their writing, and that's a terrible one. Last of all, he had that rare gift of almost universal credibility. It was no mean feat to produce credible characters out of the Crusaders, the Talisman, and the armoured knights of Kenilworth, and the warriors, the Covenant, and the Moss Hags. There'd be a lot to be said for not reading Scott until you got to the university. I had Ivanhoe and Talisman and many of the others as holiday tasks as schoolboy, and I had to learn Scott all over again. He's a much, much more mature taste than merely a schoolboy's reading. Now, Sir Walter had a fierce pride of race. He absorbed a tremendous amount about country life in Scotland. His youthful follies in Liddesdale, in which there was then no roads. In the Highlands was still the land of the white-tailed eagle, the kite and the goshawk, where men still lived who'd seen the Jacobite cause go down in 1745. Pride of race gave Scots work so much of their power. But it was a generous patriotism, which is the love of one's country, and is nothing to do with the strident business of pushing one's country down everybody else's throat. He turned his reader's gaze from foreign values, contemplating the rich store of our native traditions. There were only 4 years in age on Sir Walter's side, he the elder, between him and Jane Austen. His Waverley and her Mansfield Park came out in 1814. 2 years later, his Antiquary and her Emma were published. Nothing could have shown the difference more clearly, the genius of Scotland and England. Almost at their publication, Scott's writings were seized on, first by the English, and then the public of one continental country after another. The fire he'd kindled in the heather of Scotland blazed over the border and leapt the channel. All the world seemed to be dry tinder for it. They read his writings as those who were romantic, who was a lover of the past, but one who had his feet firmly planted in the present. He was the first great historical novelist. His books were totally clear of any taint of propaganda. He had no desire to preach to anyone. He was wholly free from egotism. He brought a new concept of goodness, which was not merely a choice between a theoretical right and wrong. He loved to put his heroes in between two warring worlds, between government men and Jacobites, cavaliers and roundheads, where they could see the good that existed in both sides. In the powerful phrase used by Mr. Harold Macmillan, your president of the last year, in Waverley and Old Mortality, and throughout these tales, he gave the meaning of true tragedy. Not the conflict between right and wrong, but that between right and right. By this he rendered a lasting service to reason. The earth of his day crackled and smoked for the revolution. But these things passed Sir Walter by. He had no use for abstractions or slogans. It has been said of him that the force of his writings came with his emotion and inventive zest. He was superb witness of the human scene. He's not a match for Robert Louis Stevenson when he came describing landscapes. He never wrote anything like the description in Weir of Hermiston, which is said to be the glen of Tweedsmuir that Stevenson wrote. Here the wind blows, it blows in the ship's rigging, hard and cold and pure. The hilltops huddle together one behind another like cattle in the sunset. Then nobody ever else has written anything that could do that. Andrew Lang's poem on Homer ends with the lines of surge and thunder of the Odyssey. This same surge and thunder that spread Walter Scott's reputation across the border into England, across the Channel into Europe, and to the farthest confines of Russia. There's something that is hard to define about the making of an author's reputation. In these days, people wrote long literary letters to each other, which few do nowadays. They met to discuss authors and literature. There was a form of mouth-to-mouth communication which could spread a man's reputation abroad, and from the universities there then radiated powerful ripples. It could be hard to follow. I went out to Uganda in the old colonial Ministry of Service more than 40 years ago. We met at, my father was at that time, as you perhaps remember, an established novelist named John Barkin. And I was met at Kampala by a large cheering crowd who gathered to greet me, as somebody had told them that I was the son of John Bunyan. It's not exactly sure how literary reputation spread. The Reverend Sidney Smith produced the first edition of the Edinburgh Review in 1802, which had almost the monopoly of literary and philosophical criticism of the entire language. He once referred to Scotland as that knuckle end of England, that land of Calvin, oatcakes and sulphur. But that was the last of that kind of talk. Scotland was to England no longer hateful, no longer hideous. Now English tourists were flooding into Perthshire. The price of post horses had something like doubled. In 1822, George IV, largely inspired by Walter Scott, visited Edinburgh. In 1841, Queen Victoria presided over the Braemar gathering, and Balmoral came into being, and Landseer put this world on his canvas. In the closing year of the century, my father formed the Oxford University Caledonian Club. The qualifications for entry were severe. You had to have been Scots prove you were Scots on both sides for 2 generations. This stung the English reprisals who tried to form a rival English club. My father always said they found only 2 people who could match up the qualification or admit that they did. Now, of course, he'd gone down for a long stretch on the Race Relations Act. But this urge for everything Scottish, which was entirely started by Sir Walter, the flood ran harder and harder and is running at flood tide now. My uncle Walter Buchan, some of you may have known him, was town clerk of Peebles, a considerable genealogist in that part of the world, wrote the official county history. And he used to get letters from all over the globe from people who wanted knowledge or information about their ancestors who were coming from Peebles or those parts. In Manor Valley near Peebles, the scene of the Scott's novel Black Dwarf, there still stands, and you may know it, a little peel tower, which belongs to that famous reaving family, the Lewises of Manor. And just after the last war, my father got a letter from a German general seeking his help, tracing his ancestry. It was a certain General Hermann von Lewis von Manor. In 1947, the Indian subcontinent obtained independence. Other countries followed in Africa and Asia as well. 3 of the most important did not promote their own native sons to be their first commander-in-chief of their now independent armies. They chose Scots generals in India, Ceylon and Ghana. It is in no small part due to Sir Walter Scott that we are the most powerful small race since the ancient Greeks, because we've established our influence worldwide. The 2 principal reasons why we emigrate is we've always produced far more highly educated Scots than there are highly educated jobs in Scotland. Also, the rule of primogeniture has forced Scots to emigrate and seek their fortunes. But we have 2 very remarkable talents to sell. First of all is our genius for survival. Unless you think it is an art or a science, you're wrong, and least of all is it an accident. It is a natural genius we have. The second is our ability to go to the ends of the earth, live perfectly happy there, while stoutly maintaining that Scotland is the finest country in the world. And why people don't find us more unbearable than they do, I've never been able to make up. And curiously, those who left for Scotland in the most traumatic circumstances, like the Jacobite emigration of the 18th century, or the Highland clearances of the 19th, have never retained any bitterness for Scotland, however they may have been treated. And the fact the world welcomes us in a very large part due to Sir Walter. Now Scotland's our home, but the world is our opportunity. What else remains of Scott beside his books? Historical novelty, largely invented, has now long been an accepted form of literature. He lives on in people's minds. He's one of the very few writers or public figures of whom almost everybody has a clear picture in their minds, drawn perhaps from more than 20 likenesses of him. When they read him, they can see him. And I can think of only 3 other people who I regard that as true. The beetle-browed Dr. Johnson, the tall, straight-nosed Duke of Wellington, and the sturdy Winston Churchill. Those 4 men are part of all our lives. We can see them when we read them. And I know nobody else to which it applies. And Walter Scott is part of our lives. He'd been dead now for nearly more than 200 years now since he was born. In the last 6 years, 6 major books have been published about him. Their titles alone show the abiding interest that people take in him. 200 years since he was born. Just look at the titles. One speaks, the 3 start with Walter Scott. One speaks of his ruin, another of his achievement, a third of his formative years. Another calls him the wounded falcon, yet another the great unknown, last of all the wizard of the north. Well, he's been dead now since the beginning of the 1830s, and 2 years after he died, Thomas Simpson, a hardy employee of the Hudson Bay Company, who joined that service about 100 years exactly before I took service myself with the same company in the same latitudes, exploring on the company's behalf, followed the course of the Mackenzie River to the Arctic Ocean, then travelled westward to Point Barrow and planted the Union Jack on the company's ensign that linked the Western Arctic and the Pacific on the map of the world. Turning eastwards, he ascended the Mackenzie River again and wintered at Great Bear Lake. And during the midst of that winter, which I know so well, when the brief light of day, there's the orb of a blood-red sun, you drink the toast of the Walter Scott. Sir Walter.